A mountain man lost everything and moved into a rusted cabin with his dog. Cold winds howled through broken boards, and he was ready to die alone. But in the silence of that shack, something stirred a forgotten hymn, a flicker of faith, and the cry of children at his door. When his estranged daughter begged for shelter, the bitter recluse faced a choice: close his heart forever, or fight to rebuild what he thought was gone. With nothing but a loyal hound at his side, he patched the walls, lit the lamp, and found hope where ruin once stood. But danger rode hard on their trail. A violent man claimed his family as his own, and shadows circled the cabin. From ashes and fear, neighbors gathered. A preacher raised his voice, and a battered old man was forced to choose between vengeance and redemption. What they built in that valley would shock everyone who once counted him lost. Can a broken mountain man truly rise again and turn a rusted shack into the beating heart of a new beginning? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. Mark Rourke slumped in his saddle as his horse picked its way through the Colorado highlands. The late autumn wind cut through his worn coat, making him pull the collar tight against his neck. His loyal hound Bear padded alongside, gray muzzle pointed forward, breath forming small clouds in the chilly mountain air. The setting sun painted long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Mark's stomach growled, reminding him it had been too long since his last proper meal. His saddlebags held only a few strips of dried beef and some stale biscuits. The bank had taken everything else: the ranch, the cattle, even most of his dignity. "Ain't much left for us now, old friend," he muttered to Bear, who looked up at him with understanding brown eyes. The dog's devotion was one of the few constants left in Mark's life since Sarah had succumbed to the fever last spring. Their children, all grown now, had scattered to the winds like autumn leaves, some to California, others to Kansas City, each carrying a piece of his heart with them. A half-frozen creek gurgled nearby, its banks crusted with ice. Mark followed, its winding path through a stand of bare aspens, hoping to find shelter before nightfall. The temperature was dropping fast, and his bones ached from too many nights sleeping on cold ground through the trees. He spotted a dark shape of cabin, or what remained of one. The tin roof had partly caved in, and the log walls leaned precariously. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. "Whoa there," he called softly to his horse, dismounting with stiff movements. Bear trotted ahead to investigate, nose working overtime as he sniffed around the cabin's weathered door. Mark led his horse to a lean-to attached to the cabin's side. It wouldn't keep all the snow off, but it would break the wind. He unsaddled the animal, giving it a pat on the neck before turning his attention to the cabin itself. The door hung crooked on one leather hinge. Mark pushed it open, wincing at the loud creak that echoed through the valley. Inside, broken glass from a shattered window crunched under his boots. Mouse nests made of shredded paper and cloth filled the corners, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. "Reckon this'll have to do," he said to Bear, who had followed him inside. The dog sneezed in response to the dust they'd stirred up. Mark said about making the space livable. He swept aside the broken glass with his boot, cleared away the worst of the mouse nests, and gathered what dry wood he could find. Soon, a small fire burned in the rusty stove, pushing back the gathering darkness and taking the edge off the cold as he worked. Mark talked to Bear, his voice rough from disuse. Not much to show for 50 years of living, is there? A played-out horse, a faithful dog, and whatever we could fit in those saddlebags. He paused, running a calloused hand over Bear's head. Sarah would have known how to make this place proper homey, though. She always did have that touch. The mention of his wife brought a familiar ache to his chest. He could almost hear her voice, gently scolding him for letting himself get so low. But Sarah was gone, buried beneath the cottonwoods back at the ranch. That wasn't his anymore. As Mark stoked the fire, moonlight streaming through the broken roof caught something carved into the wooden lintel above the door. Moving closer, he made out initials carved deep into the beam, J. Below them was a crude cross, the kind miners often carved for luck. Some forgotten soul had once called this place home, perhaps dreaming of striking it rich in the surrounding hills. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the walls and making the tin roof rattle. Bear pressed closer to Mark's side, offering what warmth he could. Mark wrapped himself in his blanket and leaned back against his saddle, watching the fires dance. For the first time since leaving the ranch, he felt something shift inside him. This broken-down cabin, as pitiful as it was, could be a beginning rather than an end. He had his hands, his tools, and enough knowledge to make repairs. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. As the night deepened and the cold intensified, Mark found himself whispering words he hadn't spoken since he was a young man. Lord, I ain't asked for much lately, and I ain't been particularly grateful neither. But if you're listening, help me find my way again. Amen. Bear's tail thumped once against the floor, and Mark smiled faintly. Tomorrow would bring work patching the roof, fixing the window, making this place weathertight. But for tonight, he had shelter, he had his dog, and he had the first stirring of something that felt almost like hope. The pale light of dawn crept through the broken window, casting long shadows across the cabin's warped floorboards. Mark stirred from his uneasy sleep, his bones stiff from the cold. Bear lifted his head from where he lay near the dead stove, thumping his tail in morning greeting. Might as well see what we've got here, Mark muttered, pushing himself to his feet. In the growing light, he could better assess their shelter. The cabin was larger than he'd first thought, perhaps 15 feet by 12, with a small alcove that might have once served as a kitchen space. Rusted pans hung from crooked nails, their surfaces pitted with age. A broken shelf sagged against one wall, still holding a few tin cups and a dented coffee pot. Mark ran his fingers through the dust, revealing the wood's original color beneath. Bear padded around the room, sniffing intently at one corner. The floorboards there seemed looser than the rest, and something about their arrangement caught Mark's eye. Kneeling down, he noticed tool marks around the edges of one board. What you found there, old friend? Mark worked his knife between the boards, prying up first one, then another. The wood came away with a groan, revealing a space beneath. There, wrapped in an oilcloth, gone stiff with age, sat a small wooden chest. Mark lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. The brass clasp was green with verdigris, but opened easily enough. Inside, he found several book hymnals with water-stained pages and leather-bound journals. Beneath these lay a hand-carved wooden cross, its surface smooth from years of handling. Setting aside the cross, Mark opened the first journal. The writing was faded but still legible, written in a steady hand. May 15th, 1868. Lord, I claim this land as holy ground. Each morning, I pray these mountains will yield their silver, not for my glory, but for yours. The winter was harsh, but you saw me through. I've carved your symbol above my door, trusting in your providence. Mark's throat tightened. He'd seen that cross on the lintel yesterday, not knowing its meaning. Reading further, he found pages filled with prayers, hopes, and simple accounts of daily life. The miner's faith shone through every entry, steady as the North Star. Standing slowly, Mark took the wooden cross to the cleanest wall. He found a nail and hung it carefully, the morning light catching its worn surfaces. Something about this simple act felt right, like setting a cornerstone. The day passed in steady work. Mark gathered tin scraps from around the property, hammering them over the worst holes in the walls. Each bang of his hammer echoed through the valley, accompanied by Bear's occasional bark at startled birds. As evening approached, Mark sat in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Bear lay at his feet, content with their day's labor. Without thinking, Mark found himself humming an old hymn from the books he'd found, one his mother used to sing. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The melody caught him by surprise, stirring something in his chest. He thought it died with Sarah. It wasn't happiness exactly, but something close to peace. He couldn't remember the last time he'd allowed himself to sing or even hum. The days that followed fell into a simple rhythm. Each morning, Mark hauled water from the creek, the ice crackling under his boots. He repaired shutters with wood salvaged from fallen trees, patched the roof with pine branches woven tight, and cleared years of debris from the cabin's corners. Bear proved an eager helper, dragging smaller branches to the woodpile and standing guard while Mark worked. The dog's presence made the long hours less lonely, his occasional whines and barks breaking the mountain's silence. Slowly, the cabin began to hold its warmth. Mark noticed it first in the evenings, when the fire's heat stayed instead of disappearing through countless cracks. The repaired shutters kept out the worst of the wind, and the patched roof no longer leaked with every snowfall dot as he worked on the cabin. Mark found his thoughts returning to the miner's journals. He read them in the evenings by lamplight, finding comfort in the unknown man's words. Like him, the miner had faced the mountain's challenges alone, yet had found purpose in making this small corner of wilderness his own. One evening, watching snow fall softly outside the now-sealed window, Mark allowed himself to believe what he'd been afraid to hope. They might just survive the winter here. The cabin was far from perfect, but it was becoming something he hadn't had since losing the ranch home. Bear stretched out by the warm stove, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. Mark reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, feeling grateful for this faithful companion. The wooden cross caught the lamplight, its shadows dancing on the wall, and Mark felt that stirring in his chest again, like a door long rusted shut, was slowly beginning to open. The afternoon wind cut like a knife through Mark's worn coat as he swung his axe. Each blow sent wooden chips flying, adding to the growing pile of split logs beside the cabin. The work kept him warm, even as dark clouds threatened snow from the steel-gray sky above. Bear lay nearby, head on his paws, watching his master work. Suddenly, the old hound's ears pricked up. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he rose, staring intently down the rough trail that led to their cabin. Mark paused, leaning on his axe handle. Bear's instincts were rarely wrong. The dog's gray muzzle pointed toward movement in the distance, a wagon, creaking slowly up the path, its wooden wheels struggling against the frozen ruts dot. As the wagon drew closer, Mark could make out a thin woman at the reins, her shoulders hunched against the cold. In the back, several small shapes huddled under threadbare blankets. Something about the woman's profile made his heart stutter in his chest. "Susan?" he whispered, hardly daring to believe the wagon pulled to a stop. His daughter, the last time he'd seen her, she'd been barely 20, proud and angry, driving away from the ranch with her new husband. Now, 5 years later, her face was drawn and pale, fear evident in her eyes. "Pa," she said softly, her voice carrying on the bitter wind. We need help." Mark stood frozen, emotions warring in his chest, joy at seeing his daughter, shame at the state of his meager cabin, anger at the years of silence. Then one of the blankets shifted, revealing a small face, and he saw the bruises on Susan's wrist as she reached back to comfort the child. His jaw tightened. Those marks told a story he didn't want to read, but couldn't ignore. Bear whined softly, padding over to the wagon, his tail wagging uncertainly as he sniffed at Susan's skirts. "Your husband?" Mark asked, his voice rough. Susan's eyes filled with tears. "We can't go back, Pa. The children." She glanced at the huddled shapes behind her. "We haven't eaten proper in days." I didn't know where else to turn. Mark looked at his daughter, really looked at her. The proud young woman who'd ridden away was gone, replaced by someone who'd seen too much hardship. The children in the wagon his. Grandchildren, he realized with a start, watched him with hollow, hungry eyes. He shouldered his axe, fighting down the mixture of anger and shame that threatened to choke him. "Best come inside, then," he said gruffly. "Storm's brewing." Relief flooded Susan's face. She climbed down stiffly from the wagon, helping 3 children descend after her. 2 boys and a girl, the oldest no more than 7, the youngest barely. Walking. They clung to their mother's skirts, watching Mark and Bear with wary eyes. The cabin was warmer than outside, but still humble enough to make Mark wince as they entered. He'd managed to patch the worst holes and clean up the debris, but it was a far cry from the comfortable ranch house where Susan had grown up. "Ain't much," he muttered, stirring the fire in the stove, "but it's shelter." Susan touched the wooden cross on the wall gently. "It's safe," she whispered. "That's what matters now." Mark set about making supper, adding precious dried beef to the pot of beans he'd been soaking. The children sat close together on his bedroll, their eyes following every movement. Bear settled near them, and slowly, the youngest reached out to touch his fur. They ate in tense silence, the thin stew disappearing quickly into hollow bellies. Mark had 1,000 questions, but they could wait. The children were falling asleep. Where they sat, exhaustion finally overwhelming fear, Susan helped him arrange bedrolls near the hearth. Once the children were settled, she sat at his rough-made table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "He's looking for us," she said quietly, staring into the cup. "Told everybody in town I'd stolen his children. He'll track us, Pa. He won't let us go easy." Mark's hands clenched on the table. The thought of someone hurting his daughter, his grandchildren, he forced his fingers to relax. "We'll figure something out," he said, though he had no idea what Dot's sleep was long in coming that night. Mark lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside and the soft breathing of his unexpected guests. Before dawn, he rose quietly and stood over the sleeping children. In the faint light from the banked fire, he could see their faces relaxed in sleep, innocent despite what they'd endured. His solitude was over, he realized, watching their peaceful breathing. The quiet life he'd been building here would never be the same. But looking at those small faces, his daughter's children, his grandchildren, he knew he wouldn't have it any other way. The morning after Susan's arrival, Mark stood at the cabin's rear, studying the sagging roof. Patches of sky showed through gaps in the rough planks, and melting snow dripped steadily onto the floor below. He couldn't house his family in such conditions. "Susan," he called, gesturing to his daughter, "come learn how to shore this up proper." She approached cautiously, still unsure of her place here. Mark showed her how to select straight pine poles, trimming them to length with his axe. Together, they worked to brace the weakest sections of the roof, their hands growing sticky with pine sap. "Hold this end steady," Mark instructed, positioning a pole. "That's it. Just like when you used to help with the barn repairs, remember?" A ghost of a smile crossed Susan's face. "You always said a Rourke should know how to fix what needs fixing." The children watched from below until Mark set them to gathering rocks from the creek bed. "Good-sized ones," he told them, "for rebuilding the hearth proper." The oldest boy, Timothy, took charge of his siblings, making a game of finding the smoothest stones. Bear patted after little Mary, the youngest at 4 years old. The old hound stayed close as she toddled between rocks, his tail wagging gently when she showed him her finds. Mark watched them from the roof, his heart warming at the sight. That evening, Susan stirred the beanpot slowly, her voice quiet in the fire-lit cabin. "I should have written, Pa. Should have told you what was happening." She swallowed hard. "At first, I was too proud. Then I was too ashamed." Mark sat at the rough table, running a thumb over his tin cup. "I reckon I share that blame. After your ma passed," he cleared his throat, "I pushed everyone away. Weren't right of me." "James seemed so different at first," Susan continued, her voice bitter. "Charming, full of big dreams. But after we married, those dreams turned to drinking and—" She glanced at the children, lowering her voice. "The first time he raised his hand to me, I told myself it was the whiskey. By the time he started in on the children, I knew better." Old anger rose in Mark's chest, but before he could speak, a commotion erupted by the stove. Bear, seizing an unguarded moment, had snatched a fresh biscuit from the pan. The children burst into delighted giggles as the unrepentant hound retreated to his corner, tail wagging as he devoured his prize. Mark couldn't help but chuckle at Bear's antics, and even Susan smiled. The tension eased as they settled in to eat. Though Mark noticed how his daughter startled at every sound from outside, days passed in a rhythm of work and wary peace. Mark taught the boys to split kindling, while Mary followed him around the cabin, chattering about everything she saw. Each meal began with grace now, the words coming easier to Mark's lips as the days went by, though they still felt strange after. So many years of silence, but he didn't miss how Susan tensed whenever horses passed on the trail below, how she would hurry the children inside, counting heads with frightened eyes. Mark had seen that fear before, in wild things caught in traps, and it made his blood run cold. One afternoon, he spotted fresh hoofprints in the creek mud several. Horses, riders asking questions at the trading post down the valley. Susan's husband was hunting them, just as she'd warned. That night, after the children were asleep, Mark sat by the fire with his axe across his knees. The whetstone rang soft and steady as he worked the blade to a keen edge. The sound drew Susan from her bedroll. "Pa?" she whispered, wrapping her shawl tight. "No man's gonna drag you or these little ones away," Mark said quietly, testing the axe's edge with his thumb. "Not while I draw breath." Susan touched his shoulder, her hand trembling. "He won't come alone. He's got friends who think like him, who believe a wife is property. Then they'll learn different." Mark set the whetstone aside, his voice hard as iron. "This here's holy ground now, girl. Ain't no evil gonna prosper here." The fire crackled low, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, Bear's low growl echoed in the darkness, answered by a coyote's distant cry. Mark gripped his axe tighter, knowing that somewhere out there, trouble was riding closer with every passing hour. The creek gurgled beneath a thin sheet of ice as Mark made his way down the snowy bank, 2 wooden buckets swinging from his shoulders. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines, and his breath frosted in the cold air. Bear trotted ahead, sniffing at deer tracks in the fresh snow. A movement across the creek caught Mark's attention. A man emerged from the trees, leading a sturdy paint horse. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. Mark recognized him as one of the Comanche who farmed in the valley below. The man raised his hand in greeting. "Water runs clearer upstream," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the creek. "Less mud where the horses don't cross." Mark nodded stiffly, his old prejudices rising like bile in his throat. He'd heard stories about raids and scalping parties since childhood, though he'd never seen such things himself. "Name's Henry Two Feathers," the man continued, guiding his horse across at a shallow point. "Notice smoke from your chimney these past days. That old mining shack stood empty a long while." "Mark Rourke," Mark replied tersely. "Just passing through." Henry's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Those patches on your roof won't hold against the next snow. I know better ways, if you're interested." Before Mark could refuse, Susan's voice called from behind him. "Pa, do you need help with the—" She stopped short, seeing Henry. Henry dipped his head respectfully. "Your daughter?" "Yes," Mark answered, surprised by the genuine warmth in Henry's manner. "Susan and her children are staying with me for a spell. Children need meat to grow strong," Henry said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out several lengths of braided leather. "I can show them how to set rabbit snares. Better than depending on that old dog's hunting skills." Bear woofed softly, as if objecting to this assessment of his abilities. Susan laughed, the first real laugh Mark had heard from her in days. "We'd be grateful," she said, touching her father's arm. "Wouldn't we, Pa?" Mark hesitated, but something in his daughter's hopeful expression made him swallow his pride. Much obliged, he managed throughout the morning. Henry worked with Timothy and his younger brother, showing them how to set snares in the rabbit runs near the cabin. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with excitement as Henry demonstrated the proper knots. "Your well needs attention," Henry observed, nodding toward the broken structure behind the cabin. "Ice has split the stones, but it can be fixed. Save you hauling water every day." Mark watched as Henry explained how to rebuild the well's walls, using clay mixed with pine needles to seal the gaps between stones. They worked side by side, Henry's experienced hands guiding the repairs. Despite himself, Mark found he was learning things he'd never known about frontier survival. As the afternoon waned, Susan insisted Henry stay for supper. The cabin felt warmer somehow as they gathered around the table, steam rising from bowls of bean soup. Mark poured coffee into tin cups, offering the first to Henry without hesitation. "Bear seems to approve," Henry commented as the old hound settled near his feet. "He has good instincts about people." The following morning, Henry returned with a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside were strips of dried meat, dark and rich-smelling. The children gathered around eagerly as he shared the jerky. "Mind you save some," Henry said with a gentle smile. "That old dog of yours will want his share." As if on cue, Bear's tail thumped hopefully against the floor, making everyone laugh. Mark watched his grandchildren crowd around Henry, showing him the rabbit snares they'd practiced making. Something tight in his chest began to loosen like ice breaking up in spring. That evening, after the children were asleep, Susan sat beside her father by the fire. "Henry's a good man," she said softly. "Sometimes help comes from unexpected places." Mark nodded slowly, running his fingers over the smooth handle of his axe. "Reckon I've carried some wrong thoughts about his people. Trust is like that roof." "We're patching," Susan mused, gazing up at the newly repaired beams. "Built one board at a time, each piece making the whole stronger." Mark thought about Henry's quiet strength, his willingness to help strangers despite surely having faced prejudice before. "Might be you're right about that," he admitted. "Might be I've got some learning yet to do." The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the darkness, a lone owl called. Mark felt something shift inside him, like the first thaw of spring after. A long, bitter winter. Heavy snow blanketed the mountain, transforming the landscape into a sea of white. Mark watched through the cabin's newly repaired window as thick flakes drifted down, piling against the rough-hewn walls. The morning light filtered gray through low clouds, but inside, the cabin glowed with purpose. "We need more firewood," Mark announced, pulling on his worn leather gloves. "Storm might last days." Susan nodded, wrapping a woolen scarf around her neck. "Timothy can help stack while I tend to the younger ones." Together, father and grandson trudged through knee-deep snow to the woodpile. Timothy's small hands gripped each log determinedly as Mark split them with practiced swings of his axe. Bear circled them, leaving deep paw prints in the fresh powder. "Grandpa," Timothy puffed, his breath clouding. "Is this really our home now?" Mark paused, axe mid-swing. "Reckon it is, boy. Long as we need it to be." Back inside, Susan had spread out scraps of paper on the crude table, carefully printing letters for her children to copy. Lamplight cast warm shadows across their faces as they bent over their work. Tongues poking out in concentration, Mark settled into his chair by the fire, pretending to whittle while secretly watching his daughter teach. Her voice was patient, just like her mother's had been. Pride swelled in his chest, though he tried to hide it behind his gruff exterior. As evening drew in, the wind picked up, howling through the pines. Susan lit the second lamp, its glow reflecting off the tin walls. The youngest child, Emma, discovered the water-stained hymnals Mark had found weeks ago. "Mama, can we sing?" she asked, holding up the warm book. Susan glanced at Mark, who gave a slight nod. She opened the hymnal, smoothing its wrinkled pages. "Amazing Grace," she began softly, and the children joined in, their young voices clear. And sweet. Mark sat silent at first, but when they started Rock of Ages, something stirred in him. His deep, rough voice joined theirs, rusty from disuse but growing stronger. Bear lifted his head, adding an occasional howl that made the children giggle. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, their voices rose above it. They sang hymn. After him, the familiar words bringing comfort and memories of better days. Even Mark found himself smiling as Emma tried to teach Bear to sing along. "This place needs a proper name," Timothy declared during a pause between songs. "Not just the old mining shack. Hope House," his little sister piped up, "because we've found hope here." Mark felt his throat tighten as Susan's eyes met his across the room. "Hope House," he agreed gruffly. "Seems fitting." The next morning, heavy snow still fell. A familiar figure emerged from the whiteness, Henry Two Feathers, leading his paint horse laden with bundles. Bear barked a welcome as Mark helped unload smoked venison wrapped in deerskin. "Winter comes hard to the mountains," Henry said, stamping snow from his boots by the fire. "My people have weathered many such storms." As he warmed himself, Henry shared stories of Comanche winters, of how his ancestors survived the harshest seasons through preparation and community. Mark listened intently, noting how the children gathered close, drawn in by Henry's quiet voice and gentle manner. "When I was young," Henry continued, "my grandfather taught me that winter is not our enemy, but our teacher. It shows us our strength and reminds us why we need each other." Susan served coffee in tin cups, its rich aroma mixing with wood smoke. Bear had settled by the children, his tail thumping contentedly as they stroked his gray muzzle. Mark watched them, all his family and their unlikely friend gathered in this place that had once seemed so desolate. The cabin felt different now. Gone was the musty smell of abandonment, replaced by the sense of pine smoke, coffee, and drying. Herbs Susan had gathered. The children's drawings decorated the walls alongside the miner's cross. Even the creaks and groans of the old timber seemed more like the settling of a living thing than the complaints of a ruined dot, as Henry shared more stories. Mark realized how much his world had expanded since that first cold night alone. Hope House, he thought, looking around at the warm scene before him. His granddaughter had chosen well. Hope had indeed taken root here, growing stronger with each passing day, each shared meal, each story told, each hymn sung into the darkness. The storm continued outside, but within those rough walls, something precious was building a home, a haven, a place where healing could begin. The evening shadows stretched long across Hope House as Mark stoked a dying fire. Susan had just put the children to bed, their soft breathing mixing with the crackle of burning pine. Bear lay curled near the hearth, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. Susan lingered at the table, her fingers tracing the grain of weathered wood. "Pa," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." Mark settled into his chair, noting the tremor in her voice. The lamplight caught the fading yellows of old bruises on her wrists, marks she'd tried to hide beneath her sleeves. "Thomas," she began, then stopped, twisting her apron. "He's not the man I thought I married." The drinking changed him, made him cruel. Tears welled in her eyes. He'll come looking. He always does. Says a wife is property, same as his horses. Or his land. Mark's weathered hands found the hymnal, gripping it until his knuckles went white. The familiar rage rose in his chest, the kind that had driven him to isolation after his wife's death. But now it was different. This anger had purpose. He hit the children? Mark's voice was low. Dangerous, thought Susan nodded, wiping her eyes. Timothy tried to protect me once. Thomas knocked him down. She drew a shaky breath. I've run before, but he always finds us, drags us back, says it's his legal right. Mark stood, pacing the rough floorboards. The old miner's cross caught the lamplight, reminding him of prayers and promises. Violence beckoned how easy it would be to meet Thomas, with lead instead of mercy. But the cross spoke of another way, one his late wife would have chosen. Susan, he said finally, long as you're under this roof, no harm will come to you or the little ones. I swear it. He touched her shoulder gently. Your mama would have been proud of your strength. The next morning, Mark saddled his horse before dawn. Need flour, he told Bear, who whined at being left behind. Stay and watch them. The trail to town wound through stands of aspen, their leaves trembling gold in the morning light. Mark's mind churned with Susan's confession, with the weight of responsibility settled back on his shoulders. He'd thought himself finished with such burdens. The church stood plain and sturdy at the edge of town, its white paint peeling. Inside, Preacher Matthews looked up from his Bible as Mark's boots echoed on the wooden floor. Mark Rourke, the preacher said warmly. Been a while since you darkened my door. Mark removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Need advice, preacher, about legal matters. He explained Susan's situation, watching the older man's face grow grave. Wish I had better news, Matthew sighed. Law sees marriage sacred, gives husband's authority over wives and children. Seen too many judges send women back to cruel men, all proper and legal-like. He leaned forward. Sheriff might sympathize, but his hands are tied by the law. Mark's heart felt heavy as iron as he rode home, flour sacks across his saddle. The justice he'd hoped for seemed as distant as the snow-capped peaks. Prayer came easier now than it had in years, but today the words stuck in his throat. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Bear's growl brought Mark fully awake the next morning. The old dog stood rigid at the cabin door, hackles raised. Mark grabbed his rifle and slipped outside. Fresh hoofprints marked the mud near the creek. Someone had watched the cabin in the night. Bear sniffed the tracks, growling low. Mark followed them to where they disappeared into the pines. Inside, Mark found Susan already up, pale but determined as she stoked the morning fire. She didn't need to ask about the tracks. The fear in her eyes told him she already knew. Mark hung the rifle back on its pegs and knelt beside her at the hearth. We'll face what comes, he said quietly. Together. The miner's cross caught the first rays of sun through the window. Mark closed his eyes, praying for strength, not for violence, but for whatever lay ahead. The hymnal's words echoed in his mind. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Bear kept close to the children as they went about their morning chores, his watchful eyes scanning the tree line. Mark knew Thomas was out there, watching, waiting. The confrontation was coming, as certain as winter follows fall. But this time, Susan wouldn't face it alone. The days crept by like shadows across the cabin floor. Mark stood at the workbench, fitting another thick wooden shutter, while Susan held it steady. His hands worked a familiar rhythm of hammer and nail, each strike echoing his determination to protect his family. These'll hold against anything, short of a battering ram, he said, testing the sturdy pine boards. Susan nodded, her eyes constantly darting to the windows. The children played quietly in the corner with Bear, who hadn't left their side for days. "Timothy, Sarah, come help your grandpa with these hinges," Mark called. The children scrambled over, eager to help. Their small hands passed him nails while he worked, their faces serious with concentration. Bear watched from his post by the door, ears pricked at every sound from outside. "Will the bad men come, Grandpa?" Sarah whispered, her small fingers clutching his sleeve. Mark's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. "Don't you worry none about that," he said gently. "Bear's keeping watch, ain't that right, old friend?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, but his eyes stayed fixed on the door. That afternoon, hoofbeats approached the cabin. Bear's low growl preceded Henry Two Feathers' arrival, but the dog relaxed when he recognized their friend. Henry's face was grave as he dismounted. "Strangers in town asking questions," Henry said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee Susan offered. "3 men. One matches your description of Thomas. They're being careful, but they're working their way up the valley, cabin by cabin." Mark's jaw tightened. "Much obliged for the warning, Henry." "Perhaps you should consider moving on," Henry suggested. "I know safe places in the high country where—" "No." Susan's voice was firm. "I won't uproot my children again. They need stability, a home." She touched the wooden cross on the wall. "We found that here." Henry nodded respectfully. "Then I will keep watch when I can. The valley has eyes, and not all belong to those who wish you harm." After Henry left, Mark added extra logs to the woodpile inside. If trouble came, they might need to stay shut in for days. Susan filled every pot and bucket with fresh water, while the children sorted dry beans and corn, preparing for a siege they didn't fully understand. That evening, they gathered around the table for supper. Mark had just finished saying grace when Bear's growl cut through the quiet like a knife. The dog stood rigid, hackles raised, staring at the window. Outside, shadows moved beyond the reach of their lamplight. Under the bed, Susan whispered to the children, who quickly obeyed. Bear positioned himself between the door and where the children hid, his growl continuous now. Mark lifted his rifle from its pegs, checking the load with practiced hands. "Stay away from the windows," he murmured to Susan. She nodded, moving silently to gather the children's blankets. Through the night, Mark stood guard. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind could have been footsteps approaching. Bear remained alert, occasionally growling at sounds too faint for human ears. Susan dozed fitfully beside the children, her hand never far from the knife at her belt. Dawn broke pale and cold across the snow. Mark's eyes burned from watching through the night, but he stayed at his post until full light revealed the valley. When he finally stepped outside, the evidence was clear. Multiple horses had circled the cabin in the darkness. Their tracks wound through the trees, some coming within 20 paces of the door before turning back. "They're testing us," Mark said when Susan joined him, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. "Seeing how we react, what defenses we have." "Like wolves circling the herd," Susan whispered, her voice tight with fear. Mark squeezed her shoulder gently. "Wolves we can handle. It's men we've got to worry about." He looked at the heavy snow clouds building over the peaks. "Storm's coming, girl. Both kinds." Inside, the children emerged from their hiding place, Bear still glued to their side. They moved quietly, helping Susan with breakfast while Mark checked and rechecked their supplies and defenses. The old cabin seemed to draw in on itself, as if gathering strength for what was coming. "Pa," Susan said softly as they watched the children eat, "I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door." Mark turned to his daughter, seeing not the frightened woman before him, but the little girl who used to ride on his shoulders. "This is exactly where trouble belongs," he said firmly. "With family." The snow began falling as he spoke, thick flakes that would soon blanket their tracks and the valley. Below, somewhere out there, Thomas and his men were waiting, planning. But inside Hope House, the fire burned warm. Bear kept his vigil, and the family stood together, ready to face whatever storm might come. The winter storms wrapped Hope House in thick blankets of snow, sealing the family inside like a warm cocoon. Days stretched into weeks as drifts piled higher against the reinforced walls. But within the cabin, a different kind of warmth began to grow. Susan sat by the fireplace. Her children gathered close as she taught them the hymns from the rescued books. Her clear voice lifted in amazing grace, while Timothy and Sarah's small voices followed, sometimes stumbling over the words, but always eager to try again. Mark paused in his whittling to listen, his rough hands stilling on the wood as memories of his wife teaching these same songs washed over him. That was their grandmother's favorite, he said softly one evening after the children had finished singing. The words felt strange in his mouth. He'd rarely spoken of Rachel since her passing. She used to sing it while hanging wash. "Tell us more about Grandma," Sarah begged, crawling into his lap. Bear lifted his head from his place by the fire. Thumping his tail against the floorboard's dot mark cleared his throat, surprised to find the memories didn't sting as sharply anymore. "Well now, did I ever tell you about the time she chased off a bear with nothing but a cooking pot and a wooden spoon?" The children's eyes grew wide as Mark spun tales of frontier life, of cattle drives and spring roundups, of Indian trading, posts and telegraph lines stretching across the wilderness. Susan listened too, remembering some stories from her childhood, hearing others for the first time. Henry Two Feathers became a frequent visitor, always bringing something to share. A pouch of dried beans, herbs for medicine, stories of his own. The children adored him, especially when he taught them to identify animal tracks in the snow around the cabin. "The deer are moving lower," he observed one afternoon, showing Timothy how to read the delicate hoof prints. "Spring will come soon." Mark nodded, noting how naturally Henry worked with the boy. "Much obliged for all you've done, Henry. We wouldn't have made it through winter without your help." The two men had developed an easy friendship, built on respect and shared concern for the family's safety. When Henry spoke of Comanche winters and traditions, Mark listened with genuine interest, recognizing wisdom in the old ways. Inside the cabin, daily life took on comfortable rhythms. Susan mended clothes by lamplight, while Mark repaired tools at his workbench. They found themselves sharing jokes over supper, teasing each other about burned biscuits or tangled fishing line. The sound of their laughter, once so rare, became common as winter's grip slowly loosened. Bear regained his strength, no longer the tired old hound who'd limped into the valley months ago. He romped with the children in the snow, always keeping them within sight of the cabin. Always alert despite his playfulness, thought the changes in the children were most striking. Their hollow cheeks filled out with health, nourished by regular meals and peaceful sleep. They no longer startled at sudden noises or huddled together at the sound of approaching horses. Sarah's nightmares grew less frequent, while Timothy started talking about planting a garden when spring came. Hope House, they called their home now, and the name fit. Mark had repaired every leak, sealed every crack. The walls stood straight and strong against the winter winds. Inside, dried herbs hung from the rafters, and the children's drawings decorated the walls alongside the wooden cross. One evening, as March winds whispered of approaching spring, the family gathered for supper. As usual, steam rose from bowls of rabbit stew, and fresh bread filled the cabin with its wholesome scent. Mark looked at the faces around his table, his daughter, his grandchildren, even Bear waiting patiently for his share, and felt something shift. In his heart, without planning to, he bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice rough with emotion. It was the first time he'd prayed aloud in decades. "Thank you for this food and for the family you've restored to me." Thank you for bringing us home." Susan reached across the table and took his calloused hand in hers. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. The children, sensing the moment's importance, sat quietly. Even Bear seemed to understand, resting his head on Mark's knee. The peace of that moment settled over them like a blessing. Outside, snow still blanketed the valley, but here within these walls, spring had already arrived. Hope House had become more than shelter. It was the home they'd all been seeking, built not just of timber and tin, but of love, forgiveness, and renewed faith. They lingered at the table that evening, sharing stories and songs until the lamp burned low. For those precious hours, it felt as if all storms had passed, as if the happiness they'd found could never be touched by darkness again. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunshine glinting off melting snow. Mark stood at the cabin door, watching Sarah and Timothy build a snowman while Bear romped nearby. The peaceful scene shattered when Bear's head suddenly snapped up, his playful demeanor transforming into rigid alertness. A deep growl rumbled in Bear's chest. The dog's hackles rose as he positioned himself between the children and the trail. Mark's hand tightened on the doorframe as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Inside now, Mark called sharply to his grandchildren. They scrambled to obey, recognizing the tension in his voice. Bear's barking grew fierce as the riders approached, his normally gentle nature replaced by protective fury. Susan appeared at Mark's shoulder, her face draining of color. "It's him," she whispered. "That's Thomas in the lead." Mark's jaw clenched as he recognized the cruel set of the man's features. Susan's husband sat tall in his saddle, flanked by 2 rough-looking hired men. Their horses' hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they drew up before the cabin. "Well, well, Thomas," drawled, his lip curling in a sneer. "Quite the cozy scene you've made here with my wife and children." Mark stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the cabin door. He kept his voice steady. "They ain't your property, Thomas. They came here seeking safety, and that's what they'll get. A woman belongs with her husband." Thomas spat, swinging down from his horse. "The law's on my side, old man. Stand aside." Inside, Mark could hear Sarah whimpering. His hand found the handle of his axe, propped against the cabin wall. The law don't account for bruises and broken spirits. "They're staying here." Thomas's face darkened. "Last chance. Send them out, or we'll take them." "No." Mark's grip tightened on the axe handle. The first punch came from one of the hired men, catching Mark across the jaw while Thomas circled toward the door. Mark staggered but swung the axe handle, forcing them back. Bear launched himself at the second man, teeth finding flesh as chaos erupted. The brawl was brutal and swift. Mark fought with desperate strength, but he was outnumbered. Fists and boots found their mark again and again. Blood ran into his eyes from a split above his brow. He heard Susan screaming, the children crying, Bear's snarling cut short by a vicious kick. Through the haze of pain, Mark saw Thomas throw a lantern against the cabin wall. The oil spread across the dry wood like liquid fire, flames leaping hungrily toward the roof. Smoke began pouring through the doorway. "Susan!" Mark tried to shout, but his voice came out as a croak. He struggled to rise from the bloodied snow. Through blurred vision, he saw Susan burst from the cabin, a child under each arm. She ran through the smoke, dragging Timothy and Sarah to safety as flames devoured the roof beams. The heat was intense, making the snow hiss and steam. Thomas mounted his horse, watching the destruction with cold satisfaction. "This is just the beginning," he called out. "I'll be back for what's mine." The 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode away, leaving devastation in their wake. Mark lay in the churned and bloody snow, watching helplessly as Hope House burned. The wooden cross, the rescued hymnals, the children's drawings, all of it consumed by flames. Bear limped to his side, whining softly, his gray muzzle stained red where he'd fought to protect the children. The roof beams cracked like gunshots as they collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the winter sky. Susan huddled with her children in the snow, their faces streaked with soot and tears as they watched their sanctuary burn. The heat of the fire melted the surrounding snow, creating a muddy circle of destruction. Mark's body ached with each breath, but the pain in his heart was worse. Everything they'd built, every moment of peace they'd found, seemed to rise with the smoke and disappear into the cold mountain air. The familiar weight of loss settled over him once more. Heavy as a burial shroud, the flames roared higher, consuming the last of their hope. Mark could only watch as the roof fell in completely, sending up a final explosion of sparks. The crackle of burning timber filled the air where hymns had so recently echoed. Bear pressed against his side, offering what comfort he could, as father, daughter, and grandchildren stared at the burning ruins of their restored life. The peaceful morning had transformed into nightmare, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in the snow. Mark's blood stained the white ground crimson, a stark testament to their shattered peace. The taste of defeat was bitter in his mouth as he watched their home, their Hope House, burn down to ashes in the mountain snow. Henry, too. Feathers found them huddled in the snow as dusk approached, the ruins of Hope House still smoldering in the distance. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in Mark's bloodied form, Susan's tear-stained cheeks, and the trembling children clinging to their mother. "Come," Henry said simply, helping Mark to his feet. "My home is yours." Bear limped behind them as Henry led the battered family through the gathering darkness. His hogan stood solid against the winter wind, its wooden walls and earthen roof a promise of shelter. Smoke curled from the central opening, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Inside, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. Susan immediately set to cleaning Mark's wounds by the light of Henry's oil lamp. Her gentle hands dabbed at the cuts on his face with a cloth dipped in warm water, but Mark barely felt the sting. His eyes were distant, focused on some internal darkness. Henry knelt beside Bear, examining the dog's injuries. "Your friend fought bravely," he said, carefully wrapping a strip of cloth around the hound's ribs. Bear whimpered softly but held still, seeming to understand the help being offered. Timothy and Sarah huddled together on a pile of blankets Henry provided, their small faces still marked with fear. Eventually, exhaustion overtook them, and they drifted into uneasy sleep, their fingers intertwined as if afraid to let go even in dreams. Days passed slowly in Henry's hogan. Mark's body healed, but his spirit remained wounded. Shame weighed on him like iron chains. At night, when sleep eluded him, he would slip outside, drawn to the distant shape of the burned cabin. The blackened timbers stood stark against the snow, a monument to his failure. During one such night vigil, Henry found him standing in the cold, staring at the ruins. The older man's moccasins made no sound on the snow as he approached. "You see only what is lost," Henry said quietly, following Mark's gaze. "A house is wood and nails, friend. It burns, it falls, it returns to earth. But a home?" He touched his chest. "A home lives here. In people. In love that survives fire." Mark's voice was rough with grief. "I failed them. Again. First my wife, then my children scattered. Now this. Everything I touch turns to ash." "You stood against 3 men to protect your daughter," Henry countered. "Bear fought beside you. This is not failure." Mark shook his head, feeling hollow inside. What good did it do? "We're homeless. Susan and the children are still in danger." "I couldn't, Father." Susan's voice came from behind them. She stood wrapped in a blanket, her face pale in the moonlight. "We believe in you. The children and I, we haven't lost faith." "Why?" Mark's question held all his pain. "What have I given you but a burned home and broken promises?" Susan stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. "You gave us shelter when we had none. You opened your heart when it was scarred. You fought for us." Her voice grew stronger. "Thomas destroyed a building, but he didn't destroy our family. That's what matters." Mark looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Despite everything, her eyes held the same determination he remembered from when she was small, the same unwavering spirit that had helped her survive a brutal marriage and flee to safety. "The children still pray every night," she continued softly. "They pray for you, for Bear, for Henry. They know what truly makes a home, even if Thomas tried to burn it away." Henry's quiet voice added, "Your family needs your strength now, friend, not your despair." The truth of their words slowly penetrated Mark's grief. He thought of the wooden cross that had burned with the cabin, remembering the miner's prayer for holy ground. Perhaps the prayer had been answered, not in the cabin itself, but in the family it had sheltered, in the bonds that had grown stronger despite, or even because of, their trials. Looking at Susan's face in the moonlight, Mark saw not just his daughter, but his wife's strength living on. He saw his grandchildren's resilience, Henry's wisdom, Bear's unwavering loyalty. These were not marks of failure. They were threads of hope, weaving together even in darkness. The smoking ruins still stood in the distance, but Mark began to see them differently. Not as an ending, but as proof that they had created something worth fighting for. Something that could be built again, stronger than before. For the first time since the attack, Mark felt the hollow feeling in his chest begin to fill with something else. Not quite peace, not yet, but determination. His family was depending on his strength, not his surrender to despair. He had lost a building, but he had not lost what mattered most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Mark, Susan, and Henry approached the blackened remains of Hope House. Mark's steps were still unsteady, his body bearing the marks of the fight, but determination straightened his spine. The foundation stones remained solid beneath the ash, a testament to what had been built there. "We could clear this away," Henry said quietly, kicking at a charred timber. "Start fresh." Before Mark could respond, the creak of wagon wheels echoed through the cold air. He turned, expecting trouble, but instead saw Preacher Collins driving his cart up the trail. Behind him came more wagons, loaded with lumber and tools. Familiar faces peered from beneath wool hats, storekeepers, farmers, even some who had turned away when Mark first arrived in the valley. The preacher stepped down from his wagon, his boots crunching in the snow. "Brother Mark," he said, extending his hand. "We heard what happened. This family is worth standing by." Mark stared at the offered hand, throat tight. After a moment's hesitation, he gripped it firmly. "We brought what we could," called Tom Wilson, the miller who had once refused Mark credit. "Lumber from my yard, nails from Peterson's store." His wife climbed down from their wagon, carrying a basket of bread and preserves. More wagons arrived, forming a circle around the ruins. Women set up tables for food while men began clearing debris. Children darted between the adults, carrying water and small tools. Susan organized the growing crowd with quiet efficiency, directing where supplies should go, ensuring everyone had hot coffee despite the cold. "I reckon we can have the frame up by sundown," said Jacob Meyer, a carpenter who had kept his distance. When Mark first settled here, now he studied the foundation with professional interest. "Foundation's good. We'll build it stronger this time." Mark watched in amazement as the valley folk worked together. Young boys hauled away burned timbers while their fathers cut fresh lumber to size. Women laid out meals on makeshift tables, their chatter mixing with the ring of hammers and saws. Even Bear seemed to sense the change, limping between workers with his tail wagging. Accepting scraps and pats. Henry worked alongside everyone, his skills with wood earning respect from the other men. There were no sideways glances, no muttered comments, just grateful nods when he suggested better ways to join the beams or brace the corners. When it came time to raise the first wall, Preacher Collins called everyone to gather. Mark, he sighed, holding out a hammer and nail. You should drive the first one. Mark stepped forward, aware of all eyes upon him. His hands trembled slightly as he positioned the nail against the fresh timber. The sound of the hammer striking true echoed across the valley. Something broke loose in his chest. Not pain, this time, but release. Tears slid down his weathered cheeks, freezing in his beard. Right then, Jacob called out, breaking the moment with practical purpose. Let's get these walls up before dark. The work continued as afternoon stretched toward evening. Lanterns were lit, casting golden light across the rising structure. The walls took shape, stronger than before. Every beam was checked, every joint secured. This house would stand against more than winter storms. Susan moved among the workers, pouring coffee and serving stew from steaming pots. The children helped too. Timothy handed nails to the carpenters, while Sarah kept the younger ones organized, playing games away from the construction. As night settled over the valley, Mark paused to catch his breath. The frame of the new house stood complete, silhouetted against the stars. Already, it was more than the old cabin had been, larger, sturdier, built by many hands instead of just his own. Quite a sight, Henry said, coming to stand beside him. Your valley has good people. My valley, Mark repeated softly. For the first time, the words felt true. He wasn't just a lonely man in a borrowed cabin anymore. These people, neighbors he had barely spoken to before, had made him part of something larger than himself. The work continued by lantern light, voices calling back and forth in the darkness. Every strike of a hammer, every board raised into place, felt like an answer to the prayers he had whispered in that first cold night. Not just shelter being built, but community, family, hope made real in wood and nails. Susan appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. Look, she whispered, pointing to where Sarah and Timothy played with the other children, their laughter rising above the sound of work. They're not afraid anymore. Mark squeezed her hand, watching as more wagons arrived with additional supplies for tomorrow's work. The valley had rallied to them, turning loss into beginning. In the warm glow of the lanterns, he saw not just a house taking shape, but the answer to years of loneliness. He was no longer alone. The morning sun had barely touched the new cabins roof when Bear's warning growl cut through the dawn. Susan's husband and his men rode into the valley, but this time they pulled up short. Instead of a vulnerable shack, they faced dozens of townspeople working on the nearly completed house. Mark stepped forward, his axe hanging loose at his side. Henry Two Feathers stood beside him, along with Jacob Meyer and several other men from town. The morning light caught the silver cross pinned to Preacher Collins' coat as he walked deliberately toward the mounted men. You have no place here, the preacher declared, his voice carrying across the yard. This community stands against men who abuse their wives and children. The law may be slow to change, but we are not. Susan's husband sneered, but his confidence wavered as he counted the faces turned against him. Women who had tended Susan's bruises glared openly. Men who had helped raise the new walls gripped their tools with purpose. A man has rights to his family, the husband blustered, but his hired men were already backing their horses away. Not here, Tom Wilson called out. Not when he uses his fists on them. If you return, Henry added quietly, you will face frontier justice, the kind that leaves no traces. The husband's face reddened with rage and shame. His gaze swept the crowd. Once more, seeking any hint of support but finding only stone-cold rejection. With a curse, he yanked his horse around and spurred it hard, his men following close behind. Susan clutched her children close, tears streaming down her face as she watched her tormentor disappear down the trail. Mark touched the preacher's shoulder. Gently. "Thank you," he said softly. "I reckon there's more than one way to find justice. The Lord's strength flows through many voices speaking as one," Preacher Collins replied. "Sometimes the greatest courage is standing together." Spring blossoms dotted the valley as the last nails were driven into Hope House. The new cabin stood proud against the mountains, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the sunlight. Wide windows caught the morning light, and the gathering hall stretched, twice the size of the original shack. Mark stood back, bare at his heels, marveling at how much larger and stronger it was than before. Inside, Susan arranged benches donated by neighbors, creating rows where children from nearby homesteads now gathered for reading lessons. Her gentle voice carried through the open windows as she taught them their letters and numbers. The walls, decorated with Henry's woven blankets and the rescued miner's cross, seemed to glow with welcome. The sound of approaching horses made Bear's ears prick up. Mark's heart skipped as he recognized the riders, his other children, Thomas and Mary, come to see what rumors of change meant. They dismounted slowly, staring at the building and the bustling activity around it. "Pa," Thomas called uncertainly, taking in the scene. "We heard talk in town, but welcome home," Mark said, his voice rough with emotion. That evening, lamplight spilled from every window as neighbors gathered for hymn singing. The gathering hall filled with voices raised in praise, while children played under watchful eyes. Susan sat beside her siblings, their earlier awkwardness melting as they shared stories and laughter. Mark settled into his chair by the hearth. Bear sprawled contentedly at his feet. His youngest granddaughter climbed onto his knee, while the others leaned against him, singing along to the familiar tunes. Looking around at the full room, at his reunited family, at neighbors who had become friends, at the home built by so many hands, Mark bowed his head. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "I thought I'd lost everything, but you had other plans. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one." Mark stepped forward, aware of all eyes upon him. His hands trembled slightly as he positioned the nail against the fresh timber. The sound of the hammer striking true echoed across the valley. Something broke loose in his chest. Not pain, this time, but release. Tears slid down his weathered cheeks, freezing in his beard. Right then, Jacob called out, breaking the moment with practical purpose. "Let's get these walls up before dark." The work continued as afternoon stretched toward evening. Lanterns were lit, casting golden light across the rising structure. The walls took shape, stronger than before. Every beam was checked, every joint secured. This house would stand against more than winter storms. Susan moved among the workers, pouring coffee and serving stew from steaming pots. The children helped too. Timothy handed nails to the carpenters, while Sarah kept the younger ones organized, playing games away from the construction dot. As night settled over the valley, Mark paused to catch his breath. The frame of the new house stood complete, silhouetted against the stars. Already, it was more than the old cabin had been, larger, sturdier, built by many hands instead of just his own. "Quite a sight," Henry said, coming to stand beside him. "Your valley has good people." "My valley," Mark repeated softly. For the first time, the words felt true. He wasn't just a lonely man in a borrowed cabin anymore. These people, neighbors he had barely spoken to before, had made him part of something larger than himself. The work continued by lantern light, voices calling back and forth in the darkness. Every strike of a hammer, every board raised into place, felt like an answer to the prayers he had whispered in that first cold night. Not just shelter being built, but community, family, hope made real in wood and nails. Susan appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. "Look," she whispered, pointing to where Sarah and Timothy played with the other children, their laughter rising above the sound of work. "They're not afraid anymore." Mark squeezed her hand, watching as more wagons arrived with additional supplies for tomorrow's work. The valley had rallied to them, turning loss into beginning. In the warm glow of the lanterns, he saw not just a house taking shape, but the answer to years of loneliness. He was no longer alone. The morning sun had barely touched the new cabins roof when Bear's warning growl cut through the dawn. Susan's husband and his men rode into the valley, but this time they pulled up short. Instead of a vulnerable shack, they faced dozens of townspeople working on the nearly completed house. Mark stepped forward, his axe hanging loose at his side. Henry Two Feathers stood beside him, along with Jacob Meyer and several other men from town. The morning light caught the silver cross pinned to Preacher Collins' coat as he walked deliberately toward the mounted men. "You have no place here," the preacher declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "This community stands against men who abuse their wives and children. The law may be slow to change, but we are not." Susan's husband sneered, but his confidence wavered as he counted the faces turned against him. Women who had tended Susan's bruises glared openly. Men who had helped raise the new walls gripped their tools with purpose. "A man has rights to his family," the husband blustered, but his hired men were already backing their horses away. "Not here," Tom Wilson called out. "Not when he uses his fists on them." "If you return," Henry added quietly, "you will face frontier justice, the kind that leaves no traces." The husband's face reddened with rage and shame. His gaze swept the crowd. Once more, seeking any hint of support but finding only stone-cold rejection. With a curse, he yanked his horse around and spurred it hard, his men following close behind. Susan clutched her children close, tears streaming down her face as she watched her tormentor disappear down the trail. Mark touched the preacher's shoulder. Gently. "Thank you," he said softly. "I reckon there's more than one way to find justice. The Lord's strength flows through many voices speaking as one," Preacher Collins replied. Sometimes the greatest courage is standing together. Spring blossoms dotted the valley as the last nails were driven into Hope House. The new cabin stood proud against the mountains, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the sunlight. Wide windows caught the morning light, and the gathering hall stretched, twice the size of the original shack. Mark stood back, bare at his heels, marveling at how much larger and stronger it was than before. Inside, Susan arranged benches donated by neighbors, creating rows where children from nearby homesteads now gathered for reading lessons. Her gentle voice carried through the open windows as she taught them their letters and numbers. The walls, decorated with Henry's woven blankets and the rescued miner's cross, seemed to glow with welcome. The sound of approaching horses made Bear's ears prick up. Mark's heart skipped as he recognized the riders, his other children, Thomas and Mary, come to see what rumors of change meant. They dismounted slowly, staring at the building and the bustling activity around it. "Pa," Thomas called uncertainly, taking in the scene. "We heard talk in town, but welcome home," Mark said, his voice rough with emotion. That evening, lamplight spilled from every window as neighbors gathered for hymn singing. The gathering hall filled with voices raised in praise, while children played under watchful eyes. Susan sat beside her siblings, their earlier awkwardness melting as they shared stories and laughter. Mark settled into his chair by the hearth. Bear sprawled contentedly at his feet. His youngest granddaughter climbed onto his knee, while the others leaned against him, singing along to the familiar tunes. Looking around at the full room, at his reunited family, at neighbors who had become friends, at the home built by so many hands, Mark bowed his head. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "I thought I'd lost everything, but you had other plans. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one."